Nury, thank you so much for joining us and congratulations on this win. It was a unanimous choice by the judges from the very beginning. Your book is a very powerful combination of history, contemporary history, memoir, analysis. What prompted you to write it?
First of all, thank you so much. I wanted to thank the jury for selecting me out of those outstanding authors, a group of authors of 50, I believe. I'm humbled. It's an honor. Also, I wanted to mention what this means to the Uyghur people around the world. It also goes to it relates to your question. The Uyghur people have been eager to, desperately to the extent to tell their stories to the people around the world who can speak their mind, who can practice their religion, they can appreciate their cultural heritage that have not been the case for the Uyghur people. So first of all, I wanted to tell Uyghur story. I believe in the power of storytelling. And I also believe that unlike my past experience dealing with media, speaking 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, not enough to go into the details of the Uyghur sufferings that have been ongoing in the last 5, 6 decades. In other words, as long as I have been breathing for. And more importantly, as somebody who have lived both in China and the free world, I feel that I'm indebted to the Uyghur people, that I could help them to tell their stories, to make a relatable story. There are a lot of historical relevance to the Uyghur suffering, specifically to the experience of Jewish people during the Second World War. Enslavement, for example, collective punishment, enforced disappearances. So these are the things that are very relatable. So the Uyghur people need to educate specifically those who have similar cultural, historical experience. Finally, I feel that the books that have been written to date, mostly either on China or in academic nature. And it has a lot of academic references to the books that have been describing the Uyghur lives from the early period, the modern era, the Chinese policy, contemporary Chinese policy. But the most important that is missing is that how targeted the Chinese policies have been on specifically on Uyghur children, on Uyghur women, and how much the global businesses have been complicit using Uyghur forced labor produced products or polluting the global supply chain. So I find this to be a very, very important project. It took me 2 years to write it. And personally, this has been a therapeutical process for me. I feel that I was able to let it out because this has been building up inside me. This has been something I was eager to tell the world. I've been working on human rights for nearly 2 decades now. You know, there's a thing called early warning sign, and some of the stuff that I describe in the book have been part of my public remarks, public advocacy, human rights advocacy in the past. The international community missed that warning sign. Now we're dealing with full swing genocide.
I have to pick you up on a phrase that you used, which is very striking. You said that you'd lived in both China and in the free world. Is that to imply that China is not part of the free world? And if so, in which ways is it not free?
We have seen recently this draconian COVID lockdown resulting in a global supply chain crisis and also creating unemployment, resulting death, frustration, street protests. So I'd like to see free China, but unfortunately, China is not a free country.
You have outlined the situation in your book as being the great scandal of the 21st century, but just for lay readers who are interested, but they don't know the ins and outs of the case, could you briefly just explain who are the Uyghur people and why has China targeted them for persecution?
The Uyghur people are the other Tibetans that most people haven't heard about until 5-6 years ago. The Uyghurs are Turkic people. They speak a dialect very close to the language spoken in Uzbekistan, in Turkey, for example. The Uyghurs have been resenting Chinese communist rule for decades. And Uyghurs also had an independent country called East Turkestan, first time in 1933, second time in 1944. And then the Uyghurs also live in a massive region, landmass, that is the size of Alaska. The Uyghur homeland also rich in natural resources, has a long international border, geostrategically very important gateway to European market, Eurasian market, Eurasian natural resources. And also the Chinese treat the Uyghur homeland as a kind of a buffer zone between historically Soviet Union and Communist China. So it has a strategic significance to the Chinese in both political and economic front. For the Uyghur people, that's what they got. It's their homeland. They have been living there for centuries. So the Uyghurs, unfortunately, have been treated by the Chinese authority, Chinese government, with very subtle propaganda that they've always been others. They don't really they're not one of us. They only know how to sing and dance. They look different. They eat different food. Their climate is different. So that kind of an otherness have been quietly, subtly promoted. That helped to facilitate the ongoing acts of genocide. The Uyghur people's religion, Uyghur people's cultural heritage, Uyghur people's ethno-national identity have been treated by the Chinese or perceived by the Chinese central government policymakers as an obstacle for CCP to maintain its power, because the otherness, the ethno-religious identity that are different from the main, the ruling class Han Chinese, in their thinking, would cause political upheaval or could be reason for political opposition to the state. More importantly, Uyghur religion, even though the Chinese constitution, even though Chinese propaganda materials, the autonomy law guarantees freedom of religion, the Chinese does not really respect Uyghurs and others, Catholics and Tibetans, a way of life, specifically in a specifically spiritual life. So religion to the Chinese authority kind of seen as a sign of disloyalty to the party.
Why do you think it is that these acts of persecution and genocide, even as the wider world becomes more aware of them, have become ramped up by China, specifically in the last 6 and 7 years? What has happened to make this much more crucial in the eyes of the CCP just in this time period?
In the past 20, 30 years, the Chinese influence operations, to our disadvantage, to the disadvantage of the Western world, have been so effective. They use its economic influence, coercive diplomatic methods, economic coercion, blackmailing to buy out silence. Ironically, today, the strongest support of the CCP can be found in the Muslim governments around the world. They have been able to rally a large number of close to 40 countries, vast majority of them are Muslim countries, supporting the Chinese policies. So countries like Pakistan, for example, adamantly supports the Chinese state. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, in fact, early on, helped to round up Uyghur students from Al-Azhar University, which is the center of Islamic learning in the Middle East, and sent back to China. And those students were legally residing, studying in Cairo. During the process of writing this book, I spent a significant amount of time studying the history of Holocaust, studying the history of Cold War. And when I look back, and I was so impressed how bold leaders were, specifically during the Cold War period. We have not only one leader, we have multiple leaders stepping up to the plate, defending democratic values, freedom, Who are they today? It's hard to find a single leader that leads the world in these kind of efforts. So the politicians, the policymakers are still heavily influenced by global business, despite the fact that more than 80 global brands have been implicated in the ongoing enslavement of the Uyghurs.
The events that you relate in the book obviously relate to a specific case and place in time, but what we really noticed as judges who all work in human rights as well was that, in a sense, the book also maps out the way that any group can be targeted and dehumanized, that you begin by spreading rumors, you begin by working on stereotypes, and the end point is genocide. Do you believe that this is happening in the 21st century, but could also happen and has happened to other groups in the past and possibly in the future, that's why the book is such a stark warning?
During the Nuremberg trial, American prosecutor Robert Jackson said, "Never again." That should mean something. That meant something then, it should mean something today. But that promise rung hollow today because of the meandering, tepid response that we have seen from various capitals around the world. What concerns me is that because of the global community's ignorance, silence, and political leaders' unwillingness to show leadership, I'm afraid that we will continue to see this kind of atrocities. Just give you an example, since 2012, we have seen 3 known genocidal acts, starting with the one against the Yazidis, the Rohingya Muslims, and now the Uyghurs. There's a signs that similar type of atrocities are happening other places, such as Nigeria. When the bad actors are not held to account, when complicit actions are not punished, we will continue to see this. We will continue to see these kind of atrocities. I believe at some point that we will have a tribunal set up to deal with issues like this, because the existing international system is insufficient. When we see an ethno-religious group being abused by government action or lack of government action, or done by individuals, we've seen repeatedly, time and time again, that either turns into war, genocide, or large humanitarian crisis. So I despise those in the government. I sit in some government discussions myself today that don't treat human rights concerns as a top priority. Because if you don't pay attention to this, like the way that the international community, my own government in the United States, then it can turn to a humanitarian crisis that we're dealing with. In the Uyghur genocide, for example, this is a fact. The international community has not seen anything like this in the nature of this kind of massive collective punishment since the Third Reich, since the Holocaust era. So whose fault is that? It is on us. It is on us who can make a difference. It is on us who can lead. It is on us, specifically in the business community, to say enough is enough. And also consumers must say, not in my name.
You yourself have experience, and your family have experience, of state-based persecution in China, going back to the Cultural Revolution. I don't want to give too much away, and I don't want to over-personalize this interview, but I wondered if you'd be willing to say just a little bit about that and about your journey towards becoming an activist.
I would love to have a life that I can turn off my computers after work and spend weekends chasing my kids in the playground. But I don't have the luxury, and I would love to introduce my kids to their grandparents. My father passed away this April, and I have aging, ailing mother still stuck in China. My parents have 9 grandchildren, and my mother only been able to meet one of her 5 US-born grandchildren. She has 5 between me and my brothers. The point that I'm making, that I'm trying to make, is that the family time that I deserve, my kids deserve, my mother deserve, have been taken away from us. Since 1995, that was the time that I arrived to the United States as a student, later granted asylum, I had been only able to spend 11 months with my mother. Think about that. It's not because that we don't have means and ways to travel to meet. It's because of the retaliatory actions by the Chinese to punish me for me being a vocal advocate for Uyghur human rights. And what is my mom's crime? My mom delivered me while she was in the re-education camp in 1970. And she's still suffering. Let that sink in as well. A mother who deserves all the means and ways to be happy in this life, still suffering. This has been like 53 years if you start the time that she was taken to the camp. And now the Chinese won't let her come to the United States to meet her grandchildren. About 2 years ago, my son, who was around 4, standing right behind me here, looking at one of the pictures of my credenza, asked my mom and dad, if they were his grandchildren. I said yes, and the next question was like, how come I cannot meet them? I was in tears. It's a very simple question. A 4-year-old son, a 4 years old kid, was asking a powerful question that I have no answer. I shared this story with Secretary Blinken in my meeting with him about 1.5 years ago. I always bring this up. What can you tell a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old kid, the reason that he cannot meet his grandparents? I wrote about this in my book as well. It's painful. It's so painful, and also comparing the pain that I have suffered, or that I have had in my life, and my mother's daily suffering. I don't sometimes feel like I'm in even position to talk about this, because others' pain is much, much worse. We're talking about 800,000 Uyghur children taken away forcibly by the state, transferring them into state-run orphanages, and brag about it on TikTok. 800,000 children, at least. This is reported in the New York Times. This is more people than the population of District of Columbia. During the height of the Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, the largest number of Jews detained were about 750,000. Several of my Uyghur friends in the United States have been subject to transnational repression. The Chinese long arm is right here, part of my life. And they also punished me by sanctioning me. In December 2021, when the US Congress passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and announced a number of sanctions against the Chinese officials, they picked me and they sanctioned me. And this past May, Putin's Russia also sanctioned me. So I have been sanctioned by 2 of the world's worst human rights abusers, which is a badge of honor, by the way. But frankly speaking, you know, I'm a human being. I have emotions, I have desires, I have longing. But what I don't understand is what kind of people would do stuff like that to children. That to me is something that I never understand. I never understand that level of cruelty, and that I don't understand that level of ignorance, knowing at least 800,000 to 1 million Uyghur children been pulled away from their families' love. That I don't understand.
What do you think is the ultimate goal of the Chinese state? Do you think it's complete genocidal elimination and then occupation of the territory, or what?
So the point is that the Chinese have managed to isolate themselves, put themselves in a box, and created this negative image, which was not the case about 5-6 years ago. Yeah. So the cost for the Chinese regime is also big, huge, if not immeasurable. Now with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, everything coming to the United States had to be proven that they are not made with forced labor. It's huge. Like we're talking about PPEs that we use to protect lives. We talk about solar panels that people put on the roof to make themselves feel good that they're conserving energy, yet ignoring the fact it's made by fellow human beings who are enslaved. So everything is been touched by the Uyghur genocide. So it's not good for the society here, even the United States, not good for the. So why would they take this risk? Just one word. They always feel that Uyghurs need to be forcibly subjugated. They're controlling the Uyghur homeland, controlling the Uyghur lives, colonizing Uyghur homeland, exploiting Uyghur natural resources were already accomplished for the Chinese. They didn't have to commit the genocide. But this is something that the Xi Jinping regime decided to do. Because when you look back, as I pointed out, in 2016-17, there was a shift in the global politics. The democracy is sort of showing the sign of decline. Autocracy is on the rise. We had a authoritarian leadership in Trump in Washington become president. He was very cozy to Xi Jinping in the early part. And the international business community was in the pocket, still is in the pocket of the Xi Jinping regime. So he looked around and made a calculus. And there's no court that his people will end up being. The international organizations, WHO, WTO, UN, are kind of being badly influenced by the Chinese state. So they made a calculus and said, okay, we got to do this. We need to do this to accomplish a total control of this region so that the Belt and Road Initiative, that the signature project for the Chinese regime, Xi Jinping to be exact, will not be negatively affected. When you look at the map, the landmass, the land connection to the countries that are part of the BRI project go through the Uyghur homeland. It's 1/6 of China proper. So the total control, securitization are some of the things that are very important to the Chinese. And also, as you know, there have been violent incidents been reported. The Chinese, to the Chinese state, the stability is the paramount concern. Everything is integrated into a security space. So anything, even the businesses today, cannot say no when the Chinese state says, this is on our national security interest. This is why TikTok is in trouble today, because TikTok's owner, ByteDance, are have to do business or control content in line with the CCP's interests. This is why this is how it works in China. So everything is national security. Your way of life is national security. You religious practice is national security. Your freedom to write. We have a large number of Uyghur authors, literary critics, professors, thought leaders, custodian of Uyghur cultural heritage are languishing in the Chinese concentration camps because they are so fearful that the freedom of thought, free press, free speech, freedom of practice, one's religious freedom, will hamper this regime from expanding its influence. So the ultimate goal, I don't, as I discussed in the book, there's no clear signs of mass extermination, mass killing, but there have been clear signs of human re-engineering. They wanted to have a new type of Uyghur generation. I don't think that they will kill all of them. When you listen to their propaganda justification, you often hear them saying or making reference to the Indian reservation in the United States, the Canadian government's treatment of the native kids, that the Canadian government recently apologized, and they also make reference of the other native ethnic groups around the world, how happy that they are giving up their lives and become a member of a larger group. So they have this kind of slow motion. It was a slow motion genocide early on. You know, the punishment was so bad, as I pointed out earlier, as part of the early signs that the Western governments missed. The Chinese were implementing punishment on the spot policy since 2012. Even a valet parking attendant who is wearing the police uniform can punish you. The guns were handed out to traffic police. So they didn't have to do any of this. And they have been somewhat suffered internationally, their image, their economic interest. But I worry that the people who have been in the camp, we're talking about 3 million, according to the Pentagon, will not be able to return if they can safely even being released from the camps. This has been acknowledged in a documentary in Frontline a year and so ago, that what the Chinese government need is a mental hospital, and if they release these individuals, they will become social criminals. So I do genuinely worry that the Uyghur nation, if we don't take a necessary action, if we don't take a bold action with moral clarity to stop this, may disappear. The Uyghurs around the world may survive.
You are a Washington-based attorney and human rights activist and global international relations worker, but taking a global view, how do you maintain faith in the institutions and the processes of international relations? How do you maintain the idea that there are some people out there who are standing up for democratic and pluralistic values and international cooperation? You mentioned yourself the tide is turning towards authoritarianism.
You know, what keeps me hopeful is a slow awakening in various societies. Specifically, I'm witnessing a sea change in Washington. There is a consensus, even in Congress. Anyone who's turning to news see that our Congress sometimes is embarrassing. The way that it functions is literally embarrassing. But when it comes to China, when it comes to Uyghur human rights, when it comes to Hong Kong, rule of law, democracy that have been dismantled by the Chinese state, and also daily threat against Taiwan, and support for Ukraine to the extent, are very unified. This is a really, really hopeful sign. What I'm referencing are people in Congress, US Congress, for example, cannot even stand each other politically. We're talking about the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Anyone who have been following the news know that these two administrations are not friendly to each other. But what is amazing, incredible, is the Uyghur policy. So the China policy, the Uyghur policy that have been formulated in the previous administration have been maintained and carried out by the current administration, and to the extent it's been expanded. Case in point, in spring 2021, President Biden managed to announce coordinated sanction against China with the support of Canada, UK, and European Union. And also with the support of our democratic allies and partners, the Uyghur genocide being discussed at G7, which was not what G7 is about. G7 is not a human rights conference or gathering. This has been a very, very positive development. I am glad to see, again, I have to stay hopeful, glad to see that because of China's aggression at home and belligerence abroad, the policymakers in general public gradually seeing the regime and its nature. And the recent draconian lockdown and surge of COVID cases in China today also helping the international community to see it. So I think this is a long struggle. I have to confess, this is not a one administration, two administration work. This is going to go on for a while. But what I would love to see is that the international community, led by Western liberal democracies, we need to rebuild our democracy. We need to be a good example. We need to show that we do care human rights. We do care for people who have been suffered, and we cannot let the human rights concerns, human rights abuses, hijacked by economic interest. We've seen it over and over again. This has been my message to policymakers. Yes, it's inconvenient. It's very, very difficult to get authoritarian regime or countries ruled by strong leaders like Xi Jinping to come to the table to talk about human rights, but you don't have to talk about other things until they agree to talk to you about human rights. The one positive thing that I'm also seeing that could help is a kind of a laser focus on technology, China's technology, in the context of competition. When you look at this, is also I have also a chapter in the book called Digital Authoritarianism. The Chinese development on science and technology has not been a moral progress. Technology is supposed to make our lives easier, even to the extent supposed to foster human rights. But because of the Chinese surveillance techniques that have been misused under the guise of dual purposes, more than 80 countries have adopted. This includes some of the Western liberal democracies. Germany, for example, have adopted Chinese surveillance technologies. One company has been in the news, Hikvision, installed 400 million cameras in China. Their market is saturated. They have to sell their camera. That's the largest camera maker, surveillance camera makers in the world. And their products are cheaper compared to the Cisco cameras. So it still continue to be a desired brand for global community. Even in the United States, our hospitals, schools, prisons, in one instant, a military installation, were using or have been using a Hikvision camera. And now, because this is becoming a national security concern, and also have a hook to the Uyghur genocide, because the Chinese tested these methods as reported, either whether it be in the prison camps, the concentration camp, whether it be in private homes, whether it be on the streets. This has been used. Uyghur people's lives have been used as a lab.
What changes would you like to see being made by the readers of your book? Is there anything that ordinary people who are concerned about this can do in some way to put pressure or to change the situation for the better?
I have been living in the intersection of law, business, and human rights. And I do know a few things about the business leaders. For example, business leaders, executives care so much about what the investors think of that business or public perception. So we can use that weakness, we can use that pressure point through consumer activism. Through my book, I called it No Escape for two reasons. One, I have not been able to escape the Chinese persecution, as we have discussed. As a free person, as an American citizen, living in nation's capital, making a good, leading good, meaningful life in Washington. I have not been free. So, and this is the case for most Uyghurs. The other no escape is actually for consumers, policymakers, journalists, good citizens of the free world, that they can no longer say they did not know. They know now. Everything that they touch, the baby pajamas that they wrap their kids at night, the electronics that they use to carry out their daily business and personal activities, have been made with the Uyghur slave labor. So no one can say that they can escape this brutal reality. So my goal, my hope, my ultimate satisfaction would be if I could stir up a decent conversation within the global consumer community that says no solar panel. I would not put a solar panel made in China. I know it's made with dirty coal and made with the slave labor. Putting that kind of product on my roof is not make me feel great that I am helping the environment, conserving the energy. I also wanted to have the fashion industry, the people who in the fashion industry, the people who work in the fashion industry, to realize that they're making blood money at the cost of a fellow human being. I also wanted to remind something could be quite painful. Those of us who like French fries, don't forget that Heinz ketchup that you used to and that you consume is made with slave labor in China. So I ultimately would like to see a global consumer activism. We have seen this early last year. We advocated, we campaigned to stop people watching the Genocide Olympics in Beijing. We could not stop the Olympics. We could not have a global boycott. We only had managed to have diplomatic boycott announced by a number of countries. So what we thought that is important is to campaign that people should not watch. It happened. People responded, consumers responded. As a result, NBC, CBC's viewership dropped by nearly 50%. That's a huge loss. Initially, we appealed to the TV networks, not to broadcast. They ignored. So the similar type of consumer activism can be and should be seen in the global supply chain that has been polluted with the slave labor produced consumer products.
Final question. You mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation that this book took you 2 years to write, and that it doesn't just have political importance, it had therapeutic importance for you as well. I wondered where you're going to go forward in terms of your interests and your activism from here.
You know, I always wanted to write a book. This is something also maybe relatable to people whose first language is not English. I came here after being educated in a communist country. Its education system is very different. It's lecture oriented. You don't speak, you don't say anything. If you even ask too many questions, the teachers will dislike you. But here it's total opposite. So from that, being educated in a communist country and now having this professional life, to me, you know, the everything is possible is not hyperbolic. I think immigrants like myself should feel encouraged that they could do it. They could go to law school, they could have a meaningful experience, and they will be accepted in the societies and the countries that they become citizens of. But I am glad I did it. I am happier because I managed to let it out. Otherwise, I would be keep talking to myself. I would be keep tapping my foot on the ground. I'd be showing signs of anxiety. But now I have not only let it out, but I have shared something that has been deep inside me for so long. Like even my friends, my close associates did not know that I was born in a re-education camp. I recently gave a speech in Taiwan, and the theme of my speech was Taiwanese people must understand, must learn genocide in order to understand what this regime is capable of. And the second message is Taiwanese people should be vigilant about this concept of re-education, as comfortably said by China's ambassador to France, that once Taiwan is reunified, Taiwanese people will be re-educated. I know exactly what these mean. So I was so eager to tell my story. I was so eager to tell the stories of those women that I described, profiled in my book. It's horrific. It's painful. I have a mother, I have a wife, I have a daughter. I can't imagine what these women have gone through. We have to speak out. We have to be a truth teller. We have to tell those abusers that there will be held to account. we also need to make politicians, policymakers feel uncomfortable. If you don't do that, if you don't pressure them, they will not act. So speaking out, verbally or in a written format, are extremely important. So I'm seeing the benefit. So I encourage my readers, human rights activists, human rights advocates around the world to speak out, to be bold, to find a way to become an effective advocate by being an effective storyteller. I genuinely believe I'd like to continue this. I would love to write another book some point. I find it quite beneficial, and I'm heartwarmed by the reception. I'm heartwarmed by the level of interest that this book generated. I am heartwarmed by the level of support that I'm getting from folks like yourself. This foundation, More Foundation, recognizing my work, recognizing the suffering of my people, spotlighting, shining a spotlight on the ongoing genocide. I'd like to, at some point, write another one, describing, hopefully, an expanded version of fighting back. Because if you don't fight back, you will not stop bad actors committing human rights abuses.
Thank you very much indeed. We have kept you talking for an hour, for which apologies, but we wanted to get through it. That was exceptional. Thank you so much for your time, and congratulations, and thank you again for writing such a powerful work.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I wanted to thank the More Foundation for giving me this honor.